Hi, I'm Pastor Josiah Black of Peru First Baptist Church, and this is our ongoing Bible study series. We are currently in Colossians, and we are going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 15 through 20 today. So let me pull that up, and we will get going. Starting in verse 15, here's our passage for today. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So there's going to be a lot in this passage, a lot of things that we want to talk about and address. Actually, the first thing, as we go past our map, sorry, let me show you that just a little longer. Been doing this every time to make sure we know where we are in the world, but here's Colossae. This is the place, these are the people that this book was being written to by Paul, right here on the Mediterranean, well, just inland from the Mediterranean on a major trade route. And so definitely part of the Roman Empire. They would have controlled more or less all of this in this time, from Rome all the way around down through Jerusalem and out. So it was a huge empire. But that's where we are, Colossae. And so the first thing I want to talk about is this verse 15, because this is a pretty foundational idea to Christian theology, to what we understand about Jesus, and really to what Paul's trying to say here. So he opens up with the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So first of all, this word for image is icon or iconos. Sometimes you'll see it stylized as, means literally image or inscription. And Paul was using it here to reinforce that when we look at Jesus, when we look at his character and his life and his rule, we are seeing the character and actions of God the Father too. It's a statement that's intended to let us know that Jesus is where Yahweh is invisible to us, at least right now. Jesus is visible and intimate, and we can look at him, we can see the Son. And by understanding the Son, we can understand the Father, which of course, echoes Jesus's own words to his disciples. So it's an important verse, and it's an important piece of understanding that we have to make sure we're holding on to and keeping center as we talk about these various things. So Paul goes on to say more about the importance of Jesus. As a matter of fact, this section is subtitled in some Bibles, The Supremacy of the Son of God. So it's talking about the power and the importance of Jesus. Verse 16 goes on to say, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So that's a huge statement. It's important to understand that there were still people in the early church who jumped on board this Christianity thing, but were struggling to understand the idea that Jesus was also God, and that he wasn't just a prophet or someone that had been sent to fill a role. Remember that for the Jewish folks, what they imagined to be a Messiah, they did not necessarily make a correlation between Emmanuel, God with us, and Messiah. Those would have been two different concepts and two different notions. In their initial expectation in mind, they would have expected a very human Messiah with very human means of accomplishing his goals. And so sometimes we see Paul really hammer home these ideas about Jesus also being the Son, being God himself, so that these people who were new to this whole thing understood his position and all that. So this claim that for in him all things were created, things on heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all of it was created through him and for him. That's a powerful statement intended to put Jesus in his proper place. This is God. In him all things were created. Everything you see, all these power structures, all these earthly and human things, those are within him and below him. So you have to understand that Jesus is above all of this. He was not just a human Messiah who came to play the games that humans play. He was both human and God, which means he is bigger and above these things. So, which is what verse 17 goes on to say. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is another really interesting word, synestaken. You can see the same Greek root as the word synthesis that we might use, and this is the word that's used here in verse 17 to mean to hold together. This is important because, again, Paul is trying to say and communicate that that in the being of Jesus, all of creation literally holds together. Without him, without the Son, without God, none of this that we imagine would have order, would have structure, would have substance. All of that is because of Jesus and who he is, and that's important for a couple reasons. It's important because it, again, sets Jesus in his proper place as God, as one above and in all things, as creator and as sustainer. Those are important theological notions. But this was also a challenge to earthly authorities that would be making competing power claims, essentially. Rome would have really liked all of the Roman citizens to believe that the only thing holding the world together was the Roman Empire. That they were the beacon of civilization, they were the beacon of power and control, and that if you place your loyalty in Rome, you place your loyalty in something that will last forever and that can be relied upon. That is what they would have wanted you to believe, particularly in the figure of Caesar, the emperor, the one who would hold the most power over this whole thing. They would have loved that level of loyalty. So this is Paul trying to bring people back into focus on the one who can actually make those kinds of claims, and that is Jesus Christ. Now, it's not overt here. It is implied that if Jesus is these things, nothing else can be these things. So Paul didn't feel it was necessary to go kind of all out, but there's a tacit implication through all of this. And again, it's really intended to break that influence of culture that these folks were mired in, that would have said Rome is the end all be all. Rome is the all powerful thing. And Paul is saying, nope, no, it's not. Let me tell you about Jesus. He goes on in verse 18 to say, he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. So again, it establishes Jesus as the head of the church, which is something we know and understand, but also is intended to communicate the legitimacy and importance of that part of the Christian faith. You should be in the church. You should be part of this. Jesus is, in fact, the head of it. So you need to be involved in that. There's no notion at this time that you can sort of go off and be a Christian by yourself in a vacuum. To be a Christian, you must be part of the church in this perspective to continue to live that life. And the idea of not having that would have been problematic, because this is the thing Jesus has set up. So this is the thing he wants his followers to be part of. Of course, he is the beginning. It's another powerful statement about Jesus as creator and God, in the firstborn from among the dead, so that everything he might have supremacy. Firstborn from among the dead is a very interesting expression, because it's intended to tell us a couple things. First of all, it affirms the resurrection, which we've talked recently in other studies about how important the resurrection is to our faith. So it affirms that idea. But to call him the firstborn from among the dead is also intended to communicate to the person who's hearing it that we will also share in that inheritance. Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead, but he's not the last born from among the dead. There are going to be others, all of us, Christians who follow after him, who experience death, but then who will rise again by the power of Christ. So that is what Paul's trying to leverage and communicate here, both that Jesus is the resurrected one and that we too will share in those things. But again, so that in everything he might have supremacy. Because Paul really wants us to understand that Jesus was God. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, because in the early church, you see people spending a lot of energy trying to understand and explain how Jesus was God, that he was God, like getting really into that piece. And I think sometimes today we struggle to understand that Jesus was also human and what that means. So it's sort of like here they were like, okay, we know you know he's a guy, so let us explain to you how he's God. 2,000 years later, most of which many people have believed him to be God, we have to go back and look and say, okay, what does it mean that he was also human? And so sometimes we have to put more work in on that end. Whereas here, where Paul was working with these various communities who were trying to still understand who Jesus is, he had to really put the work in to explain that he was God. So verses 19 and 20 come together. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So that's Christian theology in a nutshell there, right? That's the notion of what Jesus came to do, his life and death, that God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him being Jesus. So again, another affirmation that he was God. And here through him to reconcile to himself all things. So this is God's mission in sending the Son in a human form, that all things would be reconciled to himself, both things on earth and things in heaven. By doing what he did and living as he did and dying and being risen as he has, Jesus accomplished this mission to reconcile all things. And by making peace through his blood shed on the cross, which of course we know, is Paul talking about the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf, on behalf of all creation. So this is a really dense little passage here in Colossians 15 through 20, and there's a lot to it. But if you've got questions about it, or if there's a piece of it that you don't quite understand, by all means, let me know. If it seems like Paul repeats himself sometimes or really tries to drive a point home, that's one, because people always benefit from repetition. And two, for Paul, as a sort of rhetorician, somebody who spoke and communicated well, there are reasons that he circles back around to these things over and over again. There was a certain way of delivering a point and making a point at this time, and that's what we kind of get here. I'm going to say it 5 different ways, but ultimately I'm saying the same thing. Jesus is God. He's supreme and ruler over all creation. So anyway, hope it was fun for you to dive in today. As always, I'll have a discussion question down below, so feel free to jump in and engage with that. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope these continue to be useful. And if you've got anything that I didn't address or that you think we should talk about, you can leave that in the comments too. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.